So in this video, we're going to talk about some sampling methods for statistics and some bias and that kind of thing. So I know you can't see this very well in the video, but this kind of data has to come from somewhere. Like anytime you see a graph or somebody says 25% of people do this, or 1 in every 4 kids do this, that data comes from somewhere. And this particular data says it's based on a survey among 15,747 smartphone owners. So obviously, like, they're trying to make conclusions about the percentage of all Americans, but they didn't go ask all Americans. They just asked these 15,747 people, because I know I didn't get asked. So this kind of data, we take a sample and then we use that sample to make claims about the population at large, whatever that population might be. In this case, it's all Americans. And so that vocabulary is important, and I want to hit on that real quick. So the population is the entire pool of people, or the entire pool from which data is drawn. Oftentimes it would be like the entire US, or like our entire school, or the entire state of Georgia. That could be your population. And then a sample is a subgroup of that population. So let's say I want to know something about all Americans, then I'm just going to ask a couple Americans my survey question, or I'm going to perform my study on those just a couple Americans and use that sample to make conclusions about the population. However, you want to get a sample that's representative of your entire population, because if I just go ask my friends, then that doesn't really represent the entire United States. Or if I just ask people that are here in my city, that also doesn't represent the entire United States. So we're going to talk about a few ways to take a sample of people usually. And it's important, all of them have some biases, but some sampling methods are more effective and less biased than others. So that's what we're going to talk about. By the way, this very much relates to doing a science experiment, where you take a sample of some greater thing at large and maybe do some experiment on it. So that's the idea. So we're going to talk about 6 different sampling methods, sometimes called collection methods, just ways of getting people together to either perform a study or maybe just ask them some sort of survey question. One way is you actually do ask everybody. That's called a census, and you've probably heard of this before. We just did one in 2020 where literally we tracked down as much as we could everybody in the United States and asked them basic questions. So that's called a census. Or let's say our entire school was the population, then a census would be if we asked every single person at school. All right, a census is nice because everybody gets included, but it's very impractical. There's a reason we only do these every few years. It's because it's really hard to track everybody down. The next one is self-selected. Self-selected is when people volunteer to be in your study, which is nice because they want to be there. But the problem with self-selected is it usually has some bias involved. For example, a lot of times this is the way we do medical studies, because we can't just force people to try new medicine. For example, when the COVID vaccine was first being tested, that was a self-selected study. People had to volunteer to be part of that because we couldn't just run around enforcing vaccines on people. So self-selected is often what medical studies are like. The problem is that tends to be people who maybe need the money if they're getting paid, or maybe it's people who already have health problems, so there might be a little bias with a self-selected study. Convenience. A convenience sampling is you just ask people who are convenient. So, for example, maybe I just ask my friends my survey question, or maybe I just put a table in front of the school and I just ask the first few people who come up to my table That's a convenience sample. It's easy to reach people are sampled. Obviously, this one is very biased because if you just do the easiest people to get, there's probably something in common with those people that makes them not represent the entire population. All right, this one is what you really want to go for. This one is the least bias of probably the bunch, the most practical. A random sample. A random sample means each member of the population has an equal chance of being sampled. That's actually easier said than done. Here is what is not a random sample. What is not a random sample is if I just go out in the hallway and start like pointing at random people and I'm like, you, and you. That's not a random sample, that's actually convenience. It's people that are near me. A random sample means I have to know for a fact that everybody had an equal chance of being picked. An example of this would be like, put everybody's name in a hat and draw out a few names to be your sample, and then you have to go track them down and ask them, but that's a random sample. Or maybe I get everybody's student ID number, and then I randomly generate a few different student ID numbers. That's a random sample. Because, like, I didn't pick them, the computer did, or I picked them out of the hat blindly. Everybody had an equal chance of being picked. I wasn't just, like, pointing at people. Because I'm more likely to be around certain people in the hallway, like maybe I'm only down here in the honors hallway, that kind of thing. So, random sample, you have to strategically make sure everybody has an equal chance of being picked. One slightly more complicated way of doing a random sample is called a stratified, or sometimes stratified random sample. Basically what you do is you divide the population into groups and then take a random sample from each group. This way is useful if you want to make sure that different groups are all accounted for. For example, at our school, maybe if I do a random sample, there's a chance that I might get like all upperclassmen and like no freshmen. So if I want to make sure I'm including people from each grade, then I could split you into your individual grades, and then within each grade, I could do a random sample. So I could randomly pick people who are seniors, randomly pick a couple juniors, randomly pick some sophomores and freshmen, and that's a stratified sample. Or for example, imagine you're at a college and you're doing some sort of survey and you want to make sure every single major is included. So like out of all the math majors, you pick some people. Out of all the science majors and psychology majors and education majors, out of each major you pick a couple people. That would be a stratified sample. All right, and one final method I wanted to talk about is a clustered sample, sometimes just called clusters. Basically, you just pick a couple clusters of people. This one is not as good as the other ones we just talked about. So basically you divide the population into groups, but then you only survey a couple of those groups. For example, let's say I just go survey the band, or I just go survey the soccer team and the basketball team. Those are a couple clusters. So you're going to do everybody just in one particular, or maybe a couple different groups. Another example would be, let's say the entire state of Georgia is my population. Then maybe I pick a couple cities to be my clusters. Like we pick Rossville and Dalton and Atlanta and Athens, and those could be our clusters. It's not everybody, but it's just a couple clusters. This is obviously problematic and it has some bias because just those few cities don't represent all of Georgia. So there will still be some bias, but it is one way that you can get a sample. There are obviously more, but these are some of the most common ways to get a sample of people from a population. All right, so we've talked about bias quite a bit. Actually, no, let's practice real quick. So imagine you're interested in whether students at your school, so this is your population, your school, students at your school, whether they think that fine arts programs are receiving enough funding. So you're going to, here's all the different ways you might collect some data. Let's discuss which sampling method these are. So you use a written survey that you give to people sitting at your lunch table. This would be a convenience sample, just people who are convenient to you. If you put a table at the entrance to the cafeteria with a sign directing students to complete the survey if they want, and to drop it in the box. This is also maybe a convenient sample, it's pretty convenient. It's also self-selected. They can volunteer to go up to the table, but they don't have to. And so that's a self-selected study. If you randomly select students from each of the 4 grades. So you're not just randomly picking, you're randomly picking from these groups. And that's a stratified sample. If you ask all the juniors and all the freshmen, those are clusters. The juniors are a cluster, the freshmen are a cluster, so that would be a clustered sample. And then if you put all the names in a hat and you draw out half the names, that would be a random sample. You're going to randomly pick just some students. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about bias. There are many ways you can have bias in surveys or studies like this. You don't need to know all these terms. I just wanted to go through a couple ways that you might see bias. Remember, bias means just when, like, it's basically the opposite of a random sample. It's like your results are going to be skewed in some way. Maybe certain people are more likely to be picked than others. So that would be bias. So I do want to say it's really hard to do a study without any bias at all. Like, it's really hard to completely avoid bias because we're human and because some of this stuff takes money and it takes time, and it's really hard to avoid complete bias. But we can do the best we can to minimize it at least. You done? Just leave it all there. All right, so selection bias is when certain individuals are more likely to be selected than others. Like if I just ask my friends, then that is selection bias. Self-selection bias is, is when you have a self-selected study, there's going to be bias. For example, have any of you ever reviewed something on Amazon or something like that? That usually demonstrates self-selected bias. When people volunteer for something, there's usually a reason. And typically, if it's a survey, you usually only respond when you have very extreme opinions about something. Like, let's say I order something off Amazon and I have it was fine, it was mediocre. I'm probably not going to take the time to go review it on Amazon. But let's say it was really, really awesome, changed my life, then I might go review it. Or if it was really horrible and I want to warn other people about it, then I'm more likely to go actually do that survey. So self-selection bias tends to be on the extremes, and it's usually more in the negative than positive. People who have negative opinions are more likely to volunteer than people who have positive opinions. All right, exclusion bias. Sometimes people are purposefully excluded from studies. Sometimes it's not on purpose, but oftentimes it is. So if anybody's excluded somehow from a study, that obviously creates bias. Survivorship bias is kind of an interesting one. Basically, this means you're going to have bias if you lose some people from your study. So, they don't survive. Basically, let's say you're doing a study on some sort of health product and it's over a few years, but what if some of those people move and you lose touch with them, or even a few of them die and you lose touch with them? Then your study is going to be just the survivors, and so it's going to be a little bias. Funding bias. You need money for these things. Also, sometimes studies are purposefully skewed because they're being sponsored by someone and they really want to prove a certain point, and so maybe they work really hard to make sure they prove that point that their sponsor wanted them to prove. So that could be a funding bias. Maybe you run out of money and can't do the study correctly or properly, so money can impact this stuff. Reporting bias is basically when the report of the data is skewed. So maybe they use accurate numbers, but they're presenting it in just kind of a misleading way. We're going to actually talk more about that in a second. Recall bias is a problem in a lot of criminal cases. Recall bias is basically the fact that we as people have trouble recalling details. Like, I can hardly remember what I ate for lunch yesterday. So, like, recall bias is if somebody asked you how many vegetables you ate over the past month, I don't know exactly how many vegetables I ate, and so there's going to be some recall bias because I'm going to have to just kind of estimate. All right, finally, we're going to talk about leading questions. A leading question is basically a prompt that kind of encourages you to give a certain answer on a survey. So for example, here it is. It prompts or leads the responder to give a desired answer. These are often set up intentionally so that you'll respond in a certain way. So imagine here's two questions, and one is a leading question, one is not. Do you have any problems with your boss? Versus, tell me about your boss. This one is more of a leading question because it's leading you to say negative things. Do you have any problems? Like, what are the problems? What are the negative things you can say about your boss? Whereas with this one, you could say anything, positive or negative. This one is leading you to say more of a negative response. Or here's another example. How fast was each car going when the accident happened? Versus, how fast was the red car going when it smashed into the blue car? First of all, this one is way more dramatic. It says smashed rather than just the accident happened. So it's already leading you to think it's like a really bad accident. Also, on the first one, it just says, how fast was each car going? But on the second one, it assumes, it leads you to say, the red car hit the blue car. Like, it assumes that fault already. And so you're more likely to kind of confirm that and to describe it in more dramatic terms because it smashed into the blue car. So this one is more of a leading question than this one because it's leading you to say that it's the red car's fault, and it's leading you to say that it was going faster. I know it seems like a very small difference, but this can really have a big impact in all sorts of scenarios. For example, like oftentimes prosecutors in criminal trials will kind of direct a witness toward a particular conclusion by being overly suggestive. It can be really subtle. I don't know if any of you have listened to the podcast Serial, but basically this was the case in that situation. Like, they kept planting suggestion in the witness's mind, like, did you see Michael at 3 p.m.? Like, and they kept saying, like, but it was probably around 3 p.m., right? It was probably around 3, and they kept like kind of planting in the witness's mind that it had happened around 3 p.m. when they weren't exactly sure. This could also be kind of like badgering somebody to conform to your answer. For example, like, you told Jennifer that you would have her order completed by Friday, didn't you? Like, kind of just badgering them to like confirm what you're saying is also a leading question. Studies show that like this kind of technique frequently provokes a response that's either grossly skewed or outright false. And so it really shouldn't be used if you want to actually remain like impartial. It creates a stressful situation. It's basically like an interrogation. And so the witness is going to kind of look for a way to get out of it instinctively by just providing what the attorney wants to hear. This is how people get falsely accused of stuff. However, if you're somebody like a lawyer or a journalist, I guess you would want to use this kind of thing. It's not maybe the most ethical thing to do, but if you're trying to get a confession out of somebody or you're trying to get them to say something, this is often used by lawyers or journalists to have people just kind of lead them to give a response. Or like a salesman could say, like, do you want the $10,000 car or the $15,000 car? By giving you prices, he's leading you to say one of the two rather than being like, oh, I want a $5,000 car. He started off with like, do you want a $10,000 car or a $15,000 car? Kind of leading you to those higher prices. Anyway, I think this is interesting. If you want to look up questioning techniques on your own, I think it's kind of interesting. So again, you don't need to know any of these terms necessarily, but you do need to be able to identify in a given scenario how there might be bias present. So for example, pause the video and see if you can think of some ways that there would be bias in each of these situations. Like in this one, the fact that you're at a football game is probably going to impact the results. The fact that you're just asking people at this particular stadium is going to impact the results. So all of that is some bias there. On number 2, you're only asking people at a PetSmart, and maybe PetSmart only sells particular pet items. So maybe they don't sell rabbit stuff, so you're not likely to get people who like rabbits there or something like that. You're also only asking people at this particular store on this particular day at this particular time. It would be better if you could spread it out over a couple days, maybe go to a few different stores, maybe a few different areas, that kind of thing. On number 3, they're going to ask the first 100 teens that walk into a Chick-fil-A. Again, this is one particular place, at one particular day, at one particular time, which is kind of a problem. Also, this one, teenagers might not be that honest with you if they text and drive, so that's kind of like a reporting bias there. And then on this one, they're only asking people in the salad line, so that's obviously a problem. Okay, there may be some more problems that you identified there, and I, again, just want to say there's always bias in these situations. We're human, but we can try to minimize them by using random samples or stratified random samples to minimize the bias that is present.